The wedding feast was hot, the champagne imported, and the bride draped in French silk. But when the preacher asked for objections, the groom didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at the woman basting a wild turkey over the open fire, and walked right off the altar. The Bitterroot Valley of Montana, in the spring of 1887, was a place that did not forgive weakness. It was a land of jagged granite peaks, endless pine forests, and winters that could freeze a man mid-breath. Eric Hayes was carved from this very landscape. Standing 6'3", with shoulders like a draft horse and a gaze as sharp as a hunting hawk, Eric was a mountain man in every sense of the word. He had built his sprawling cattle and timber empire, the Ironwood Ranch, with an axe in his hand and a Winchester rifle strapped to his back. But the wilderness was changing. The steel tracks of the Northern Pacific Railroad were cutting through the territory like a knife, and with them came men in tailored suits who fought not with bullets, but with deeds, injunctions, and banknotes. Elias Montgomery was one of those men. A ruthless Boston Railroad tycoon, Elias had managed to corner the water rights that fed Eric's lower pastures. It was a stranglehold. If Elias dammed the river, Eric's thousands of cattle would die of thirst before August. There was only one way out, an old-world compromise hammered out in a whiskey-soaked room at the territorial capital. Eric would marry Elias's 22-year-old daughter, Victoria Montgomery. In exchange, the water rights would be transferred to Eric as a dowry, merging their empires. It was a bitter contract, signed in desperation by a man who loved his land more than his own freedom. Victoria was a vision of high society perfection, porcelain skin, golden hair, and a heart as cold as a Boston winter. She despised the Montana Territory, despised the smell of pine and horses, and above all, despised Eric. To her, he was a savage, a necessary stepping stone to secure her family's western dominance. But a society wedding in the middle of the wilderness required a spectacle, and Victoria demanded a feast that would rival the grandest hotels in New York. That was how Harley Prescott found herself riding a rattling buckboard wagon up the treacherous mountain pass to the Ironwood Ranch. Harley Abbey, to those who knew her, was 26, fiercely independent, and running out of time. She was the daughter of a legendary frontier chuck wagon cook, but when her father passed away from a sudden fever in Helena, he left behind a staggering gambling debt of $800. The men holding the debt were not the forgiving sort. When the Montgomerys placed an advertisement for an executive caterer offering a sum of $1,000 for 3 weeks of work, Abby knew it was her only salvation. She arrived at the ranch 3 weeks before the wedding, stepping off the wagon in a worn canvas skirt and a faded wool coat. She didn't look like a master chef, but her calloused hands and steady hazel eyes told a story of survival. Her first meeting with Eric Hayes was born in blood and fire. Abby had immediately taken command of the massive outdoor summer kitchen, a sprawling timber pavilion with twin stone hearths. She was barking orders at 3 ranch hands, trying to organize the chaos of imported silver and cast iron skillets, when the heavy wooden doors swung open. Eric strode in. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He was covered in sweat and trail dust, and slung over his massive shoulder was the freshly field-dressed carcass of a 200-pound mule deer. He slammed the deer onto the heavy oak prep table, the wood groaning under the weight. At that exact moment, Victoria walked in to inspect the kitchen, flanked by her parasol-wielding handmaids. Seeing the blood and the dead animal, Victoria let out a piercing shriek. "Get that vile, putrid thing out of here!" Victoria screamed, pressing a lavender-scented handkerchief to her nose. "Eric, you are a barbarian. I ordered imported veal from Chicago." Eric's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, quiet anger. He looked at his bride-to-be, the resentment palpable. But before he could speak, a thud echoed through the room. Abby had stepped forward and slammed a heavy meat cleaver directly into the chopping block next to the deer. She didn't flinch. She didn't look repulsed. She looked Eric dead in the eye. "It's a fine buck, Mr. Hayes," Abby said, her voice smooth and steady, cutting through Victoria's hysteria. "Cleanly shot, too. You want the backstrap smoked over hickory or roasted with wild sage and blackberries? Eric stopped. For the first time in weeks, the tight, defensive posture of the mountain man relaxed. He stared at the woman in the flour-dusted apron. She wasn't looking at him with fear, or disgust, or the calculating greed of the Montgomerys. She was looking at him with the quiet respect of one frontier soul recognizing another. "Sage and blackberry," Eric murmured, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "And keep the tallow. I use it for the saddles." "Done," Abby said, rolling up her sleeves and reaching for her boning knife. Victoria stormed out in a flurry of silk and outrage, but Eric lingered. He watched Abby work. He watched the precise, strong movements of her hands, the way she respected the meat, the way she commanded the space. In that brief, smoke-filled moment over a butchered deer, a seed was planted, a seed that threatened to tear the impending wedding in the valley apart. Over the next 2 weeks, the Ironwood Ranch became a powder keg of tension. The wedding preparations were a monumental undertaking. 300 guests were making the trek from the East Coast, requiring the construction of temporary canvas pavilions, the slaughter of dozens of livestock, and the endless cooking of elaborate dishes that Victoria deemed civilized. Abby worked 19-hour days. Her hands were blistered from the heat of the cast-iron stoves, her face constantly smudged with soot and flour. Yet, she never complained. She poured her anxiety over her father's debts into the dough she kneaded and the sauces she simmered. And constantly, quietly, Eric was there. It started with small things. When Victoria demanded wild honey for a French pastry, complaining loudly that the local sugar was too coarse, Abby prepared to hike 5 miles down the valley to trade with a local homesteader. She walked out of the kitchen at dawn, only to find Eric leaning against the porch post. At his feet was a massive, fresh honeycomb, dripping with golden nectar. "Saw a black bear sniffing around a hollow oak up on the ridge yesterday," Eric said, not meeting her eyes, his thumb hooked in his gun belt. "Figured I'd beat him to it. Saves you the walk." "Thank you," Abby said softly, taking the heavy comb. Their fingers brushed. Eric's skin was rough, scarred from decades of hard labor, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. A jolt of electricity snapped between them, so fierce that Abby almost dropped the honey. As the days bled into nights, the kitchen became Eric's sanctuary. Whenever Victoria and her father hosted formal parlor evenings, drinking sherry and loudly discussing how they would tame the ranch once the ink on the marriage certificate was dry, Eric would slip out the back. He would sit in the shadows of the summer kitchen, whittling a piece of cedar, watching Abby work by the light of the oil lamps. They began to talk. Not the polite, empty chatter of society, but real, raw truths. Abby told him about her father, about the crushing weight of the men waiting for their money in Helena. She didn't ask for pity, and Eric didn't offer any. Instead, he offered understanding. He told her about the winter of '79, when he nearly lost his leg to a timber wolf, and how the silence of the mountains was the only religion he understood. "She doesn't love this place," Abby said one night, wiping down a table as Eric fed a log into the dying fire. She hadn't meant to speak the words aloud. It was dangerous territory. Eric paused, the firelight casting deep shadows over his rugged face. "She loves the deed to it, and her father loves the water. It's a transaction, Abby. A man does what he has to do to protect his home. Even if it means building a prison around yourself," she countered, looking up at him. Eric stepped closer. The heat of the stove was nothing compared to the heat radiating from him. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face. "Some prisons," he whispered, his voice thick with suppressed emotion, "are harder to walk into than others, especially when you realize too late what freedom looks like." He reached out and gently wiped a streak of flour from her cheek. Abby stopped breathing. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken desire. He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping second, Abby thought he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. God help her, she wanted this wild, bound man. But a burst of shrill laughter from the main house broke the spell. Eric's jaw clenched. He stepped back, the mask of the stoic rancher falling back into place, and walked out into the cold night. The breaking point arrived 3 days before the ceremony. Abby had gone to the main house to fetch a specific set of crystal decanters Elias had demanded. The house was mostly quiet, the guests having retired. As she passed the heavy oak doors of Elias Montgomery's temporary study, she heard her name. She froze, pressing herself against the wallpaper. "That cook is an eyesore, Father." Victoria's voice drifted through the cracked door, dripping with disdain. "I want her gone the moment the ceremony is over. Pay her half, and send her packing." "Patience, my dear," Elias replied, his voice a low, gravelly purr. "Let her finish the work. The wedding must be flawless to impress the territorial governor. He needs to see us as the absolute pillars of this community." "I cannot stand another minute with that brute Eric," Victoria hissed. "He smells of horse sweat and pine needles. When can we finally be rid of him?" Abby's heart slammed against her ribs. "Rid of him?" "The paperwork is already in motion," Elias said, the clinking of a whiskey glass echoing in the room. "The moment the vows are exchanged, the marital assets merge. We hold the water, he holds the land. But, under the Territorial Lunacy Act of 1883, if a wife can prove her husband is mentally unfit, a danger to himself and civilized society, she is granted conservatorship over his estate." "And you have the doctor ready?" Victoria asked. "Dr. Eris is on the payroll." Between Eric's solitary habits, his violent outbursts toward the railroad workers, and his delusions of isolationism, the judge will sign the committal papers by Monday. Eric will be quietly transported to the asylum in St. Paul, Minnesota. He will spend the rest of his life in a padded cell, and the Northern Pacific Railroad will have unfettered access to the entire valley. Abby clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. It wasn't a marriage of convenience. It was a trap, a meticulously planned legal assassination of Eric Hayes. She turned and fled silently down the hall, her mind racing. If she told Eric, all hell would break loose. The wedding would be canceled. Elias would immediately call in his debts and dam the river, destroying the ranch. Worse, if Elias found out Abby had ruined his multi-million-dollar coup, he would ensure she was never paid her $1,000. He would likely have his men alert her father's debtors in Helena. She would be ruined, hunted, and destitute. But as she ran back to the kitchen, bursting through the doors into the smell of wood smoke and roasting meats, she looked at the cedar shavings left on the floor where Eric always sat. She remembered the gentle touch of his rough hand on her cheek. She had to make a choice. Save herself, or save the mountain man who had unknowingly stolen her heart. The night before the wedding, the Bitterroot Valley was swallowed by a restless, howling wind. It whipped through the pine boughs and rattled the glass panes of the Ironwood Ranch, a wild tempest that mirrored the storm raging inside Harley Prescott's chest. She stood alone in the cavernous summer kitchen, the embers of the hearth glowing like angry demon eyes in the dark. On the wooden prep table lay her payment, a heavy leather pouch containing $500 in gold eagles, her half advance from Elias Montgomery. It was enough to hold off Thomas Sullivan, the ruthless Helena debt collector who held her father's markers. If she took the money and kept her mouth shut, she would survive. She could board the stagecoach to Helena, pay her father's blood debt, and disappear into the anonymity of the West. But if she spoke, Elias would ensure she never saw the remaining 500. Sullivan's men would hunt her down, and worse, Eric would be thrust into a war he might not survive. A padded cell in St. Paul. The words echoed in her mind, sickening and cold. She pictured Eric, a man who belonged to the high peaks and the open sky, chained to a wall, drugged and broken by a corrupt physician. Abby grabbed the pouch of gold, her knuckles white. She shoved it into her apron pocket and marched out into the gale. She found Eric in the foaling barn, far from the main house. The warm, earthy scent of hay and horses provided a stark contrast to the bitter wind outside. Eric was standing beside a nervous roan mare, his large hands moving in slow, soothing strokes over the animal's flank. He looked up as Abby entered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her pale, strained face. "You shouldn't be out here, Abby," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the wind. "Montgomery's men are patrolling the perimeter. They see you out here with me. They'll assume the worst." "Let them," Abby breathed, closing the heavy barn door behind her. She walked right up to him, the fear evaporating, replaced by a fierce protective fire. "Eric, you cannot marry Victoria tomorrow. It's a trap." Eric stopped brushing the mare. His posture stiffened, every muscle coiling like a struck rattlesnake. "I know exactly what this marriage is, Abby. It's a ransom for the water rights." "No, it's not," she insisted, grabbing his forearm. His muscles were like forged iron beneath his canvas shirt. "It's an assassination. I overheard Elias and Victoria in the study. The moment you say your vows, the marital assets merge. They don't just want the water, Eric. They want the ironwood in its entirety. They can't have the deed without my signature," he said, his brow furrowing in confusion. "They won't need it," Abby said, the words tumbling out of her in a desperate rush. "Elias has a physician on his payroll, Dr. Arthur Aris from Minnesota. Under the Territorial Lunacy Act, Victoria is going to petition the court the moment the papers are signed. They are going to declare you mentally unfit, violent, delusional. They're going to lock you in an asylum in St. Paul, Eric, forever, and the railroad will swallow your land whole." The silence that followed was terrifying. Eric didn't yell. He didn't break anything. The mountain man simply went deadly still. His gray eyes darkened to the color of slate, a terrifying, predatory calmness settling over his features. "Dr. Arthur Aris," Eric repeated softly, the name tasting like ash. "Elias brought him in on the morning train. Told me he was a groomsman." "You have to run," Abby urged, her voice breaking. "Saddle your best horse and ride for the Canadian border. Leave the ranch. It's not worth your life or your sanity." Eric looked down at the woman standing before him. She was risking everything, her money, her safety, her future, just to warn him. He reached out, his calloused hands gently cupping her face. The warmth of his touch sent a shudder straight to her soul. "I don't run, Harley," he whispered fiercely. "Not from wolves, and sure as hell not from Boston bankers. This is my land. My blood is in this soil." "Then, what do we do?" she asked, tears finally brimming in her hazel eyes. "They have the law on their side. They have the money." A dangerous, feral smile touched the corner of Eric's mouth. "They have territorial law. But Elias doesn't know the men of this valley like I do. He thinks money buys every man's loyalty. He forgot about debts of honor." Eric stepped back, his mind racing. "There is a circuit judge, Judge Horace T. Calloway. He presides over the First Territorial Court. 3 winters ago, Calloway's stagecoach went over the ridge at Dead Man's Pass. I dug him out of 10 feet of snow and carried him on my back for 2 days. He owes me his life." "Is he in the valley?" Abby asked, hope flickering in her chest. "He's in Missoula," Eric said, glancing at the barn window. "It's a 12-hour ride. If I send my foreman, Silas, right now, he can have Calloway here by tomorrow afternoon. But I have to play along. I have to stand at that altar, let Elias think he has the noose around my neck, and stall until the judge arrives. And if he doesn't make it in time, then I'll shoot Elias where he stands," Eric said, deadpan. He looked at Abby, his expression softening. "But you, Abby, you need to leave. If this goes wrong, Elias will destroy anyone who stands with me. Take the wagon. Get to Helena." Abby reached into her apron, pulled out the heavy pouch of gold, and dropped it into the hay at Eric's feet. "I was hired to cook a wedding feast, Mr. Hayes," she said, lifting her chin with a stubborn pride that made Eric's heart hammer against his ribs. "And I don't leave a job half-finished." The wedding day dawned with a brilliant, mocking sunshine. The Montgomerys had spared absolutely no expense. In the center of the Ironwood's lower pasture, a massive silk pavilion had been erected, draped in white imported lace and overflowing with white roses, shipped via refrigerated rail cars from Chicago. A string quartet played delicate waltzes that were entirely swallowed by the vast, rugged expanse of the Montana mountains. 300 guests, the absolute elite of the territory's railroad and banking syndicates, sat in neat rows of mahogany chairs. In the front row sat Elias Montgomery, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across his face. Beside him sat Dr. Arthur Arris, a thin, rat-faced man clutching a leather medical satchel that Abby knew contained the committal papers. At the outdoor kitchen, just 50 yards from the pavilion, the heat was suffocating. Abby was a blur of motion. She basted a massive wild turkey over the open fire pit, the fat sizzling and popping as it hit the white-hot coals. Her hands were steady, but her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept glancing at the eastern ridge, praying to see the dust trail of horses. Nothing. The music swelled. The ceremony began. Eric stood at the altar. He had refused to wear the tailored tuxedo Elias had purchased for him, opting instead for his finest black wool frock coat, a clean string tie, and his Colt .45 strapped unabashedly to his hip. He looked like a king of the wild, untamed, and dangerous. Victoria glided down the aisle, a vision in Parisian white silk, her face obscured by a delicate veil. But to Abby, who watched from the smoke of the roasting fires, Victoria looked like a spider moving in for the kill. The local preacher, a nervous man intimidated by the wealth surrounding him, began the service. The words washed over the crowd, solemn and binding. Abby checked the horizon again. The sun was passing its zenith. "Where are they? If there be anyone here," the preacher stammered, sweating under his stiff collar, "who knows any just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let him speak now, or forever hold his peace." The silence stretched. Elias Montgomery's smile widened. He gave a subtle, sharp nod to Dr. Arris. The preacher opened his mouth to continue. "I object." The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the altar. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 guests. The string quartet screeched to a halt. Victoria threw back her veil, her porcelain face twisting in shock. "Eric, what are you doing?" Eric didn't look at her. He didn't look at Elias. He looked straight past the crowd, past the lace and the silk, locking eyes with the woman standing by the open fire, a basting spoon in her hand. Eric stepped down from the altar. The heavy thud of his boots on the wooden platform echoed like cannon fire. "Have you lost your mind, boy?" Elias roared, jumping to his feet, his face turning a mottled purple. "The papers are drawn. You sign that registry, or I dam the river tomorrow. Your cattle will rot in the fields." "Let them," Eric said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of a coming avalanche. He walked slowly down the aisle, the sea of wealthy guests parting before him in terror. "You don't want my water, Elias. You want my land. And you brought a doctor to declare me a lunatic to steal it?" Whispers exploded through the crowd. Dr. Arris shrank back in his chair, clutching his satchel. "Lies!" Victoria shrieked, her facade completely crumbling. "He is insane, Father. Look at him. Arrest him." "Only a federal marshal can make an arrest on territorial land, Miss Montgomery." A booming, gravelly voice echoed from the rear of the pavilion. Abby's breath caught in her throat. Riding down the crest of the hill, flanked by 4 armed U.S. Marshals, was a man in a dusty black suit and a bowler hat. It was Judge Horace T. Calloway. The judge rode his horse directly into the aisle, the beast snorting and tossing its head. Calloway looked down at Elias Montgomery with absolute disdain. "Judge Calloway," Elias sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "This is an outrage. I am Elias Montgomery of the Northern Pacific. You have no jurisdiction to interrupt a private ceremony." "I have jurisdiction over every patch of dirt from here to the Idaho border." "Elias," the judge rumbled. He pulled a folded document from his coat. "And I have here a sworn affidavit, signed by an informant, detailing a conspiracy to commit medical fraud and theft of property via the Lunacy Act. A federal crime." "An informant?" Elias sneered, panicking. "Who? This savage?" He pointed at Eric. "No," Eric said quietly. He had finally reached the back of the aisle. He walked out of the pavilion and stepped into the heat of the summer kitchen. He stood in front of Abby, towering over her, his eyes blazing with an emotion that made her knees weak. Eric said. The entire wedding party turned to stare at the cook in the flour-dusted apron. You take the word of a hired servant? Victoria screamed, humiliated beyond measure. She's a nobody, a beggar. She's the woman I'm going to marry, Eric said. The words hit the valley like a thunderbolt. Abby dropped the basting spoon. It clattered against the stone hearth. She stared up at Eric, her heart completely stopping. Eric, she breathed. Eric turned back to Elias. As for the water rights, Elias, you can dam the lower river if you want. Last week, while you were measuring my house for new drapes, I secured the deed to the upper mountain springs. The ironwood doesn't need your water anymore. But you, Eric smiled, a cold, hard expression, you are standing on my property, and you are trespassing. Judge Calloway nodded to the marshals. Escort Mr. Montgomery and his physician off the ironwood. If they resist, chain them to the wagon. Chaos erupted. Elias was shouting threats of legal ruin, Doctor. Aris was desperately trying to flee, and Victoria was sobbing in a fit of absolute aristocratic rage, tearing the French lace of her gown as she stormed toward the carriages. The high society guests scrambled in confusion, fleeing the pavilion like rats from a sinking ship. Amidst the screaming and the dust, Eric and Abby stood in the quiet sanctuary of the outdoor kitchen. The fire crackled beside them. Eric reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. He handed it to Abby. I sent a wire to Helena yesterday morning, he said softly. Thomas Sullivan is paid in full. Your father's debt is clear. You're a free woman, Harley. Abby looked at the official bank draft in her trembling hands, the ink proving that the impossible weight she had carried for months was finally gone. She looked up at Eric, tears streaming down her soot-smudged cheeks. You didn't have to do that. I know, Eric said, stepping closer, the scent of pine and leather enveloping her. But I told you, a man does what he has to do to protect what he loves. He didn't ask for permission this time. Eric pulled her against his broad chest, his hands tangling in her hair, and brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was like the Montana Territory itself.